into our products by working on our own and in concert with other U.S. government agencies to bring those barriers down where we can, to make American companies aware of the opportunities that result from that, as well as to make them aware of the pitfalls that remain in the market. So Commerce is not the lead agency in conducting U.S. trade negotiations. That role, of course, belongs to our colleagues at the U.S. Trade Representative's Office. We support those negotiations with information that we get through our contacts with the business community, and so we will also often have people at the table in that capacity, along with subject matter experts from other agencies, depending on what's being discussed in a negotiation. And once a negotiation is done, we need to monitor things to see that the terms are being implemented. I'm not doing a lot of macroeconomic analysis, and rather I'm listening to what American companies are reporting to us about what they're encountering, whether that's good or whether it's bad, and using that information, that anecdotal information, to piece together ideas about what problems might need to be addressed. And the limitation of that perspective is that companies don't come to my office and call my people and say, hey, we're doing great. You're surprised, right? We tend to hear from American businesses when there's a problem that they've run into and they can't solve on their own and they need our help. So what we hear about day to day is people's bad news. And in the opposite direction, when our Russian counterparts have issues for their companies getting products into the U.S. market, or when their investors here have issues, they bring those to our attention. And so it's sometimes hard to keep on an even keel amid everybody's bad news. But there is some good news in U.S.-Russian relations that usually doesn't rise to the level of the headlines or the newscasts. Last year, American companies sold more into Russia than they've ever sold. It was nearly $11 billion worth of exports. Still not a huge amount compared to some of our top 10 or top 20 trade relationships, but it was about 29% more than what we had sold to Russia in 2011. Grew 6 times as fast as our overall global exports, and those sales in 2011 had been up 40% over what they were in 2010. So our business in the Russian market has recovered very well since the 2009 recession. I think Turkey is maybe the only large market where our business has grown faster over the last 3 or 4 years. So those export figures are a key metric of ours, and so we're glad at the recent numbers. And getting Russia into the World Trade Organization last year has made it easier to post those gains. And a lot of people have put a lot of stock in Russia's admission to the WTO as a watershed event at which they're looking to really change the game in terms of the Russian market. I'd like to here, I think maybe my main thought on WTO accession is I'd like to ground people's thoughts about what WTO is and what it isn't. And in particular, I'd like to encourage people to see WTO accession as a process, not as an event. Russia applied to join the GATT, the precursor to the WTO, back in 1994. And their process of learning what joining the organization would require, negotiating the terms of their admission, generating the political will that they had to generate to change laws and regulations from where they stood in the mid-90s, has been a very complicated journey. They needed to change very basic legislation, ranging from laws governing banking and insurance and other financial services, laws governing technical standards for products, laws requiring certain levels in transparency when they're promulgating new rules and regulations, requiring public comment and advance notice so that industry has time to comply with changes, laws providing a basis for intellectual property rights that really hadn't previously been defined, and of course the process of negotiating literally thousands and thousands of tariff adjustments on individual products. So whenever a country joins the WTO, the actual accession process is in many respects the culmination, not the start of this process of major changes and adjustments. So lots of what Russia had to do to meet WTO standards has already occurred. So, you know, I counsel companies and other people to keep realistic expectations of what Russia being in the WTO will do for the business climate, what it has done already and what it can't do. Was asked to speak a little bit about what Russia being in the WTO and being more integrated in the global economy means for its immediate region. And in the Eurasia region, economically, we see two trends going on, which simultaneously, but which sometimes appear contradictory. First, of course, we saw through the Russian WTO accession process a persistent effort on Russia's part to take the steps it needed to take in order to get more integrated into the global economy, into global supply chains, and to allow competition in its domestic market. And I think it's significant that that effort was sustained over many years across changes in the economic policy teams in the Russian cabinet, and in the face of some very significant ups and downs. You had major economic shocks in 1998 and again in 2009, and also in the face of some considerable skepticism, if not opposition from domestic constituencies in Russia. And so this negotiation process took 18 years. And so you saw a very sustained effort by the top leadership in Russia to keep it going. They acknowledge that Russia has a self-interest in playing by common rules of the game that its other major trade partners follow. They see benefits for themselves long term. Those are a bit challenging to quantify, and I'm not going to hit you with a lot of numbers. I think the World Bank estimated that Russia would see their annual gross domestic product about 4% higher than it otherwise would have been within 5 years of accession, and that's 4%, not 4 percentage points. So it's not a lot. But over the longer term, they estimated about 11% higher GDP. And when you remember that this gets compounded over time, it does matter, the impact of the increased competitiveness in Russia, the fact that Russian consumers can get cheaper goods, which raises their disposable incomes, enables Russian companies to get certain inputs more cheaply and reliably. It makes cross-border investment in both directions easier, and that can help bring world-class technologies as well as production or management methods into Russia, along with holding Russian companies' feet to the fire to become more efficient and competitive. But at the same time as this integration process is going on, we've also seen an effort led by Russia to, put most benignly, to rebuild economic links that had atrophied during the past 20 years with adjacent countries like Kazakhstan, Belarus, most successfully, and with varying degrees of success in rebuilding ties with Ukraine. The Trilateral Customs Union and the Eurasian Economic Commission are resulting in a significant convergence of regulations, customs practices, and in some ways they are arguably promoting some longer-term efficiencies within this economic space that Russia is taking the lead in trying to create. but also resulting in some cases, less rather than more openness to goods from outside that economic space. It's easy to see those efforts as opposing one another. You have the global integration on one hand, and then this regional segregation effort. I would argue that from Moscow's viewpoint, these two tracks are actually complementary. I think policymakers in Russia realize that many sectors of Russian industry are poised to face tougher competition as trade barriers fall. And so establishing the customs union in 2010 has been a way for Russia, and also, at least in theory, for Kazakhstan and Belarus to carve out some safe space in which they can trade with less pressure on them. The regional integration process has certainly complicated Kazakhstan's efforts to join the WTO since they've had to unwind a lot of the commitments that they previously had negotiated. And I think a risk for the countries in the region other than Russia is that, because Russia's the proverbial 800-pound gorilla of the regional economy, they've got the clout to call a lot of the shots in terms of, the terms of this reintegration. And the other countries that are having to make more of the changes are facing, as a result, uncertainty in their business climates and their regulatory climates. And as long as that uncertainty continues, it's going to make it more challenging for them to get outside investment, and it's going to make for a more challenging environment for their own companies. But I think on balance, having Russia join the international trade community through the WTO has an effect of binding those countries that are bound to Russia to that international community as well. And so ultimately, I think the regional integration that's going on at Russia's behest is not going to stand apart from Russia's own efforts to make sure that it's plugged into the global economy. In the interest of time, I'm going to not say very much about Western and Central Europe and Russia here. In many ways, the stakes for both the trade and investment standpoints for Europe with Russia are a lot more consequential than the stakes in U.S.-Russian relations. I'm not a Eurozone expert, and I don't want to injure you with what I haven't learned about Russian-EU relations through my day-to-day work. But the Russia-EU trade relationship is orders of magnitude larger than the Russia-U.S. relationship. Investment by European companies in Russia is much greater. But I will talk a little bit about the U.S.-Russian economic relationship and what Russia's WTO membership means for it. In terms of total trade, imports and exports combined, the U.S. was Russia's seventh largest trade partner last year, and the U.S. was the 8th largest market for Russia's exports. That sounds pretty important, right? But the thing is, Russia's WTO accession doesn't really change much for Russia's sales to us. Even before Russia joined the WTO, even before we established permanent normal trade relations with Russia in December, we had already been giving Russian products our best normal trade relations treatment. We were just doing it on a conditional basis, but we'd been doing it without interruption for 2 decades. So except for giving the Russians standing to use the WTO's dispute settlement process in cases where they disagree with some of our practices, there's not a lot that changes for what they're selling to us. The changes are more consequential for American products and services going to Russia as Russia's market continues to liberalize. Yet Russia was only our 26th largest trade partner in terms of total trade, only our 28th largest export market. So, even if we were to see a major jump in our business involvement and our economic involvement with Russia, Russia's not going to vault overnight into position as a top 10 or top 15 trade partner. So you might wonder why all the fuss about Russia joining the WTO and about our economic relationship. From my parochial perspective at the Commerce Department, we see we're in a very competitive global economic environment where we really need to fight for every sale and every job. For the American companies that are heavily engaged in selling to Russia and deriving revenues from that, it is a big deal. Look, for example, at the car market in Russia. Some analysts have Russia pegged as being on course to overtake Germany either in 2014 or 2015 as the largest single car market in Europe. That's a big deal. But some people look at what a Ford or a GM are doing in Russia, and they get scared about that. They see this work, and they see these companies and other manufacturers making hundreds of thousands of new cars in Russia, and they wonder, how is that good for the American economy? Aren't they sending jobs overseas? But a fact that gets missed in that is that those kinds of sales are not replacing sales of new cars that we had ever exported to Russia in previous years. American companies never sold very many new cars into Russia. What you're seeing Russians doing now is buying American label cars that they never bought before in their lives. They were buying pretty crummy domestic vehicles, and they were buying a lot fewer of them. So this is new business. And if you look at what U.S. companies have been doing in Russia in terms of exporting components and parts and accessories to the Russian auto industry, you'll see that it's literally several $100 million annually in U.S.-made products. These are sales that we never used to see before. And that matters. It matters for the companies that are able to do that business. Not going to be a big inflection point for U.S. economic growth, but every marginal bit helps. In wrapping up and turning over, I'll say maybe a few words to the question that was addressed about the implications of Russia's WTO accession for U.S. and Russian politics. And again, I'll caveat my thoughts by saying I want to be careful not to step too far afield of my billet as one who focuses on business environment business environment issues. First point I would make is that neither the broader Russian nor the American publics focus very attentively on bilateral economic relations or the bilateral relationship as a whole. I think that's painfully obvious to any of us who work in the field and who've tried to explain what we do at barbecues or receptions. I think the Russian public may care a little bit more about America than the American public cares about Russia. That's not a scientific assessment, but it's what I just sense from reading newspapers in both places and seeing what people are writing about. But Russia, as you know, it's rarely page one news here. And if it is, it's usually because of, a national security related issue, whether it's, Russia's stance on Syria or Russia's stance on Iran. Rarely do economics make it into that top echelon. Sometimes Russia does get some ink because of its role in key commodities markets or because of its economic role in other nations where that role is significant, Cyprus being the latest obvious example. But when you're only the United States' 26th biggest trade partner, that's going to be limiting on what the U.S. public spends thinking about you, and therefore that's going to limit the impact of Russia on the policy process and politics. And then I think it also has to do with the fact that the structure of Russia's economy, the fact that Russian companies are most competitive internationally in sectors that are largely out of the public eye. how many folks here can identify a Russian manufacturer of razor blades or lawnmowers or cars? Russia's global competitive advantages tend to be in industrial inputs. They're very important to companies here that finish steel using imported Russian slab, or farmers here that rely on Russian fertilizer. But the end products that result from this are not associated in the public mind with Russia's role in them. And when somebody sees a Lukoil gas station here in the United States, it's noteworthy because it's so exceptional in a way that a BP station or a Shell station just isn't. So if the U.S.-Russia economic relationship is not in the news, then I think it's generally not likely to have much defining impact on politics. It's long been an objective of business communities on both sides to have an economic relationship that is important enough, significant enough to provide some ballast to the relationship to dampen some of the harsh rhetoric and the uncertainty that's characterized that relationship over much of the last century. But I think the relationship is still small enough that any ballast that comes out of it in that direction is pretty small and tenuous. And what we're seeing now is a political environment where it's still very easy for political elites, particularly on the Russian side, to make some hay by standing tough, rhetorically or in practice against a perceived rival like the United States. So I think I'll stop there, but happy to take any questions as we have time.
Terrific. Thank you, Matt. Yes, it's very interesting since I personally and many of us focus on politics, so it's interesting to sort of see the everyday realities of the relationship that you're working with, and in a certain sense how little politics comes into bearing, especially once we've gotten PNTR. But Travis, you've been navigating these waters and helping to lead Boeing in this tricky strategic environment. What are some of the challenges that Boeing has been facing?
Right. Well, thanks, Laura. And first, want to say it's a privilege to follow Matt. I had the privilege of working with Matt over at the Commerce Department on some Russia trade policy issues, and even Matt supporting a trip that we and the President took over in, 2009 now. And Matt is a thoughtful, dedicated, knowledgeable, and passionate public servant. And I just want to say that is a great resource both for American companies looking to work in Russia, but also importantly for government policymakers promoting this relationship. So Matt, thanks for your service. And is a really great resource, I think, for everyone in the room that should get to know this guy. I also want to say it's a privilege to be on this panel. I am a Jackson School alumnus and a proud member of the advisory board, so I have a personal interest here. But going beyond even that, Professor Ellison was a mentor and a teacher of mine. A wonderful man who really had a huge influence on my life, my career, and my academic interests. And so to be part of a panel and part of a conference that recognizes Professor Ellison's accomplishment is just something I'm very proud to be a part of. So I want to thank the Jackson Foundation. I want to thank Rashat, the Jackson School, and the Kennan Institute for putting this together because I think it's a well-deserved tribute to a great man. With respect to my contributions to this panel, I'm at the Boeing company now. I think if you see my title, you see Boeing Defense, Space, and Security. I'm sure a lot of you are scratching your heads thinking, I didn't know we're sending a lot of arms to Russia. So I will tell you that, as Laura implied here, I've moved around quite a bit. And as of, it was until about last August, I played a role on Boeing commercial airplanes, heading international strategy and business development. And a big piece of my job there was to work with the leadership around our company to identify those key international markets that we look to do business on, and to not just look to sell products and services, not just look to export, to figure out those real partnerships that you can find around the world. So you can bring together not only the value of the commercial market, but find opportunities where you can leverage capabilities, talent, skills, and resources in those markets to bring them together in ways where you're a real strategic partner with the markets that you're working in, not just a vendor. And we worked around the world on a variety of countries, whether it be Japan or India or China, big markets. But Russia is notable. And what I'm going to do in this next 10 minutes or so is walk through a unique Boeing perspective on our relationship with Russia. And I'll go right to the punchline here to say that this is a special relationship which demonstrates, Boeing's commitment to Russia, not only as a target of exports, but we've truly benefited from Russia as a partner. And whether that be engineering or raw materials or technology and research, this has been a great mutually beneficial two-way relationship between Boeing and Russia. So I'm going to tell a very good story with respect to this industry perspective and modestly suggest that I think Boeing can serve as an example with respect to how this commercial relationship can take the next step in terms of seeing real benefit for both U.S. companies as well as the Russian marketplace. So I'll begin first with what businesses always do, is look first at the revenue question, which is this market for us. And why did we care originally in terms of Russia as a place to do business? Well, I'll tell you, first and foremost, they're buying a lot of aircraft. And if you look at this slide up here, it breaks down how many aircraft they've bought. If you look at the top right corner, that's Russia's current fleet. It's 305 Boeing aircraft, and we have 58% market share in Russia. And so that's a significant presence for us. It's a significant market for us, but it also shows our ability to be truly competitive in Russia, particularly vis-a-vis our European competitor, Airbus. And when you go beneath that, Russia unfilled orders, that's essentially saying how many aircraft have they purchased, but we have not yet delivered to them. So this is essentially our backlog. Well, this shows 60% market share for Boeing in that market, with 163 Boeing orders worth $24 billion. Now, this is a great data point for anyone working in the U.S.-Russia commercial relationship, because $24 billion translates into a lot of American jobs. And I think as we talk about the strength of the U.S.-Russia relationship and how you can find mutual benefits, I think anytime you see numbers on the board like that, it really demonstrates why having good commercial market relationships and U.S. companies selling things into markets like Russia is a real demonstration of how that can be important to the U.S. economy. As you look to the left, so that's kind of what we've done now. If you look to the left, this is our attempt to forecast around the world where we see market opportunities. And we do this everywhere in the world. We actually look globally, and we see about a $4.5 trillion market for commercial aircraft, and then we go break it down by region. And we generally don't publish individual country numbers, but we do come up with the Russia CIS market. And suffice it to say, Russia is the primary element of that marketplace. And we see over 20 years, $130 billion worth of value in the large commercial aircraft marketplace. And the two numbers there talk both in terms of their current fleet. We see that growing to 500 airplanes. And so where you get that value and you get that share of fleet is not only the additional airplanes they'll have in their fleet, but all the airplanes that they will replace. And so that combines to give you that $130 billion number. So that should put into perspective for a company like Boeing, where if you follow the market share that you see on the right part of that chart, and you look at the overall market that's out there, for Boeing, this could be a $70, $80 billion marketplace over the next 20 years. So Russia is a huge opportunity, and if we are able to execute on that opportunity, a big contribution to the export and trade balance picture and translating into American jobs at home. So I start with that because that's, I think, one of the more impressive demonstrations and tangible demonstrations of how a country like Russia can help the U.S. economy. But I then want to go further because, and you go to the next chart, which gets into some of the other things that we do. And I want to highlight two other major elements of our relationship with Russia that have come together over the past couple of years. And I want to start by saying this is unique. We have decided in Russia to set up the only international engineering design center that we have anywhere in the world. And we've called it the Moscow Design Center. And we have altogether a staff of about 1,350 engineers, 200 of them Boeing employees, about 1,200 of them contractors from companies like Progress Tech and others that are Russian design houses. But we come together in Moscow and have this engineering center work on virtually every airplane that Boeing develops and services out in the global marketplace. And we've found huge capability coming out of that design center, capability that's essentially leveraging wonderful technical expertise, a legacy of expertise in aviation, strong engineering skills, and frankly a workplace that's giving us tremendous productivity in terms of their contribution to our value chain. So this has been a huge success getting out there, and I want to say a lot of people look at some of the things we do in international markets and say, you're just doing it to gain market share or to gain market access. This is decidedly not the case when it comes to Russia, Moscow, and what we're doing in engineering. A huge contribution to our business. If you go then to the next slide, they're also the kind of other leg of our stool in Russia is as a material supplier. And this is one of the things that Matt referred to is, you're not talking at barbecues about titanium imports and things, but I'll tell you, on a Boeing airplane, titanium is hugely important and increasingly important as you go into our newer and newer models. And Russia provides 35% of all of Boeing's titanium. So they are the largest supplier of titanium outside the U.S. market. And it's fair to say on virtually every plane that you fly, there is an element of Russian titanium that's part of that aircraft. So a huge source of supply. Now, why I like this story is because we've had a titanium relationship that goes back about 15 years. It's been solid, it's been predictable, it's been consistent, and it's been huge value add for the Boeing company. But working with Russia, we decided not to stop there. The relationship started with them just sending raw material to us, and then we'd take that raw material and actually do some of the machining and the finishing work going forward. But the Russians came back and said, listen, we want to do more, and we're able to demonstrate to us that they have the capability to do more. So we did a joint venture with them, signed it in 2009, implemented in 2011, where we came together and got VSMPO, that titanium supplier, into rough machining. So all of a sudden we started moving them up the value chain where they were more than just being a raw material supplier. And for us, huge value add, because not only did they demonstrate capability, but if you just think about it, the cost savings that you get from actually doing your machining at the same place that you're getting your raw material is terrific. And so it was a real source of productivity for us going forward. So they have not only been able to prove themselves as a strong contributor from the standpoint of machining the titanium they already provided, but a neat little story here is they came up with a way to actually take the chips that come out of it. You think I'm not an expert on this, but essentially you have titanium, and when you machine it, a bunch of chips of excess titanium kind of fall apart. Well, they collect all that chip titanium and then put it down the road to their raw material factory and put it right back into the system. So we're actually able to recycle titanium, put it back into the raw material, and keep a closed loop in terms of titanium machining. Fantastic story that we weren't doing that to save Boeing a lot of money, as well as, frankly, was just a good business practice for a number of reasons. So that's a great story of some of the things that we've done to push them up the chain, and we've actually gone beyond just titanium and developed some relationships on aluminum as well. So really, Russia's proving a terrific material supplier for us, and a good example of how you can start a partnership at one part of the value chain and push it up, doing so in ways that make sense for both your company as well as your Russian partner. So if you go to the next slide, this kind of brings to, I keep expecting someone to do it for me. This is a real illustration of bringing together those pieces of the design center, some of the raw materials that we do, some of the machining that we do, and there's also some other things that I didn't highlight, including technology research and collaboration, and frankly some of the things we do on space and others that all come together to really provide huge contributions to virtually every plane that we have. And this takes our latest one, the 787, and I won't walk through all the details, but gives a good snapshot snapshot of the breadth of ways the Russian relationship has benefited the Boeing company beyond just commercial export sales. And whether it be design, IT, tooling, and in fact, we're even getting into services and support around the world, the design center in Russia has been a terrific partner for us. And then you translate that then into our overall Boeing presence, and this plays out kind of our footprint in Russia, and it's divided between our suppliers, our field service centers, and certainly our design center right there in Moscow. Altogether, Boeing's long on Russia. We're deep on Russia. And if you look at that kind of bottom tagline, we developed with them a 30-year plan to invest in Russia about $27 billion, which you divide between titanium supply, design, and other forms of miscellaneous support. So Boeing is big there. And if you see that relationship between exports and the sort of investment we're doing, it clearly is a two-way mutually beneficial relationship. So I then want to comment a little bit about on the policy side and kind of what we've seen from industry. Obviously there are issues in the relationship, and Matt is close to it. I've been part of it at different points, but I think there are some real success stories there as well alongside the challenges. And one I just wanted to point to you was what we call the polar routes. And for those of you who don't have a lot of experience in aviation, essentially countries have sovereignty over the airspace above their borders. And accordingly, anytime you do an overpass over a border, you have to have permission, and in some cases you pay a tax or two to do that. Well, the Russians control a big airspace, obviously, given the size of their country, and that airspace enables you to actually fly a plane from, let's say, North America over the pole to Asian locations, as opposed to going around the Pacific. That's hugely important from the standpoint of the Boeing company, because you save thousands of nautical miles, a ton of fuel, and you actually make realistic some point-to-point flights that wouldn't happen if the polar routes didn't exist. That was a hard thing to get done. It's because not only are you just looking for permission from the country, but you have to put in stations and all sorts of air traffic stuff. It takes a lot of cooperation between air traffic management agencies to get that stuff done. And I'll really commend the U.S. government and Russia for coming together to agreements, working over a long period of time to actually get those cross-polar routes open in 2001. And kind of the story on that is, if you guys follow aviation, you look at the 787, a big selling point for the 787 was being able to buy a plane that allows airlines to go point to point. And if you look at a lot of our sales on the 787, a ton of them have been to Asia. And being able to convince an airline that you're able to actually go point to point, North America to those Asian locations, were critical to the value proposition of our aircraft. So the support of the U.S. and Russian governments on getting those polar routes done was a huge benefit to an American company like ours, and I think a good example of where cooperation has actually served true benefits. You then go to the trade opportunity. I won't spend a lot of time because Matt did this, and Matt gave some rankings. I just want to make sure ours were aligned. I was kind of thinking through it. If they're not, Matt's right, I'm wrong.
Well,
but,
you're using the 2011 numbers.
Oh, there we go. Okay. That's why. All I'll say here is that for us, I mean, we see WTO accession truly benefiting the relationship. For us, the big one on bullet point 1 was aerospace tariffs. We had a 20% tariff for every aircraft that we were selling into Russia. That's a lot of money. And when you look at the affordability of our aircraft, if you're a Russian airline, that is a significant distortion. The WTO accession agreement took that down to 8.3%, which actually becomes a little more manageable for us, and so we've actually seen huge benefit from that going forward. And frankly, how it worked out in practice is we generally have to go on every campaign and get a big waiver on the tariff to actually complete a deal, and that was just a challenge and a problem, but taking it down to 8.3% has been a real benefit on that for that one. And from Boeing, we look back and we see just the value of international trade trade in two ways. Of course, when people trade together, they want to fly and meet and do business with each other. So we see that as a huge market growth opportunity for us. But also for us, we see benefit of the Russian economy growing because we see a direct correlation between economic growth in key markets and their ability and their desire to purchase large commercial aircraft. And so for us, we're huge, obviously big believers in free trade. We think it's good for our two countries. We also think it's very good for Russia. And so for us, we'll look at some of those stats below. You look at what their economy is and what it could be, and you see some real opportunity in terms of the trade and commercial relationship between our companies and our countries going forward. And I'll just close here with just a sense of kind of the long term. Like I said, I think modestly Boeing really has benefited from this and I think can serve as an example of how companies can really take advantage of a solid economic relationship between our two countries. Critically, though, a collaboration based on mutual benefit. I think if companies purely see the Russia marketplace as a target of exports, they're not going to unleash the real opportunity that exists there. And so for us, we've seen not only being able to generate market opportunities through exports, but also figuring out ways to leverage a skilled and truly talented workforce in some of the key areas that we need, as well as what we've found, raw materials and industrial capacity that Russia is truly differentiated on. And so I think, as a company, seeing that, being able to benefit from that two-way collaboration is a real opportunity, and I think a real bright spot in an otherwise sometimes challenging relationship going forward. So I'll stop there with that Boeing perspective and turn it over to Jill, and obviously happy to engage in questions and commentary.
That is quite a bright spot in the relationship, and it's good to hear it. Well, Jill, you have kind of a big picture view.
Yes.
And it'll be really interesting to hear to the extent that you think that all of this tremendous economic cooperation that we have is playing into the whole U.S.-Russia policy world, and give us your perspective from the CNN foreign correspondent world.
Well, I think it's a complicated picture, I'll tell you. Number one, I have been in the center in Moscow. We did a story on it, and I remember it quite vividly. Vladimir Putin was there, and I'd be eager to get back again and see what's happening, because it was a very, very interesting story, I think, on many levels. I have to preface, we were talking about my experience and what is happening, and I'll give you a very good example. Matt, you were talking about immediate political things sometimes overshadowing what's going on. This morning, for example, I will not be doing a particularly positive story. It will be the adoption story, I think. That's what I will probably end up doing. If you remember the little Russian boy who died in the United States, and just yesterday they released the autopsy, and the Russians now have it, and we expect that they'll be making some type of comment about that. It's another example of, some of the challenges in the relationship right now. Obviously, many people believe that law that the Russians instituted essentially outlawing adoptions by Americans of Russian children is a direct result of the Magnitsky Act. And so we have a lot of difficult things. I was just in Moscow working, in fact, Laura, on my never-ending thesis, which I hope to complete by the summer, if the fates are with me, inshallah. But I hope, and the subject of this is a subject that a friend of mine who's an academic said, Jill, you don't have a thesis. It is, which to my chagrin, but I'm going to write it anyway. It's on Russia's or Vladimir Putin's use of soft power. Public diplomacy, soft power. They're talking a lot about it in Russia, and I guess my mission is to find out, does it actually exist? Is it just words? Is it just propaganda? Is it a modern form of what the Soviet Union did, actually, you might argue, pretty successfully back in the Cold War days? So anyway, that's just kind of, I think, a preface to my thoughts as I come back from Moscow. I literally was there just a couple of weeks ago, doing a number of interviews with both government people and think tanks, and also people who are involved in diplomacy. And I come back with a mixed picture. And that's what I have a lot of times with Russia. It's almost as if I have a schizophrenic mind. I sometimes believe there are, excuse me, two Putins. I think there are certainly contradictory trends ongoing in Russia. And as you look at the WTO accession and what it can mean, the positives are really positive. I mean, Matt, I think you laid it out, and certainly a very vivid example with Boeing. Very positive. If you look at three possibilities, if you break it down this way, you could say it gives them the opportunity to make the structural reforms internally that they really should make if they want to be successful and competitive in the world. These are sometimes painful, as we know. It's changing, a society that existed for 70 years with a very, very different system, albeit they've been doing this, as Matt, as you pointed out, for quite a long time now, this transition. But it's still painful. And there are a lot of people who have, I think, an old mindset that they are still locked in some type of small world, which would be the former Soviet Union, and that they can keep it that way. And there are other people in Moscow who are very much attuned to the fact that they cannot remain as a somehow separate system and survive competitively in the world. However, and this, I'll come back to this later, but I think where I was talking with Will about this just as I walked in the door, there is a deep trend in Russian foreign policy, and I think in the mentality, which is a drive towards sovereignty. And it raises its head in almost everything that you look at with Russia right now. Don't tell us what to do. We are a big, important country. And as we had this conversation, even in something like the WTO, which is a whole lot of countries doing pretty much the same thing, there is, I would say, unfortunately, sometimes a Russian view, which is now that we're in WTO, that's fine, but we're a little different from everybody else, and we can't quite do it the way you guys do. Maybe eventually we will, but right now, maybe we ought to have some exceptions. And I think that you find that in so many different areas. A discussion about democracy. I've had this discussion many times, as I'm sure many of us have. Yes, you can hear in Moscow, yes, we believe in democracy, but maybe not exactly the democracy that you have, and maybe not right now. We have our own version of democracy, thank you very much, and other people accept it, et cetera. So this is, I'm not an expert in economics or trade, and so I'm giving you kind of big picture, but I do believe that these larger trends persist. I was talking to somebody yesterday for my thesis who is involved very, very high up in the Russian media. And for those of you who speak Russian, she said there's also a very old tendency in Russia, in Russia and in Russian, which is, and she used the phrase, "не оправдываться." Don't justify, don't explain, just move forward. No need to explain. Even if we're wrong or there's an intimation that we might be wrong, we're not going to explain ourselves. We will go forward. So I don't mean to throw cold water on all of this, but I do think that there's a reality. There are people that I've met in, let's say, the eastern parts, the far east of Russia, who are really entrepreneurs, who would really like to move forward, who think that Moscow is very, very far away, and who have what I would think of as an American, a Western, whatever, Asian approach to business and being successful. But many times they feel that Moscow slows them down. So I would just urge that we always look at these contradictory trends and hope that the more positive ones will continue. And I think they will, but that's maybe toward the end. I'll get back to that. So the number one thing, they can make these structural reforms that are important to them to make them able to compete and to broaden the base of their economy, to move from some of the raw materials that we all know about, oil, gas, et cetera, into other areas. I think an interesting trend, I'm not an expert on energy, but I think the shale oil phenomenon is very, very interesting because it raises issues. The West, the United States, is moving very quickly on that, as are other countries, and it raises some challenges to Russia, which has far more difficult sources of oil and gas that it should have to and continues to develop. But there are other competing sources of energy in the world right now, and that might be a little worrisome for people in Moscow. One thing also on WTO, are they going to really move forward and do the things that they have pledged to do? Good example, they haven't signed the government procurement code yet, which is significant. I am not, again, an expert, I won't go into that, but it's significant in terms of their credibility with the rest of the world. Will they follow through on the things that they have pledged to do? I think we talked about the internal changes. I'd also like to talk about the Eurasian Customs Union, because as far as I can see, it is apart, it is separate, really, from the WTO. Granted, it may help to bring some of these rules together in a more coherent form, but there is the political side to the Eurasian Customs Union. And you can see it playing out certainly with Ukraine. You know, does Ukraine join it, or does Ukraine move more toward the EU? It's really a very big decision for Ukraine. So there is a political component to that union that I think can cut both ways. Again, a desire by Russia to kind of do it themselves, have their own center of power, economic power, but also realizing that they are in the big bad world where there are a lot of economies out there competing, and that they will have to really understand that and compete. And how do they do that in a realistic way? I think also you have these trends, and again, I always have these, right now, I guess you could say I have an image, a bifurcated image of Russia this way and also this way, because you have big decisions that are very, very important, economic, some of the political decisions by Vladimir Putin that have been very good. For instance, helping the United States for overflight into Afghanistan. You know, some really positive things that don't get that much coverage. But you also have this increasing influence of domestic politics that is driving some of their foreign policy. And I think if you look at the adoption issue, it's a very strong example of that. The influence of people who believe that that the United States is out to take advantage of Russia, playing into these laws, let's say the most recent adoption law, which many Russians would consider protectionist for their children. They would think it would be a positive thing. But again, it drives, it created severe difficulties, I think, for the image of Russia recently, saying that Americans could not adopt children that have difficulties, physical or mental, emotional difficulties, didn't look good in a media PR sense around the world. And yet there is a domestic constituency that really does feel that that's justified. I just mentioned the Magnitsky Act, which we could also debate, I'm sure, here, whether that was a good idea for the United States. But that has set in train reactionary action by Russia. Then you have kicking out USAID, the crackdown on the NGOs, non-Lugar, ending non-Lugar, and getting back again to this idea of the sovereignty of Russia. a little bit more onto the subject that I am looking at in my thesis, I think if you look at this trend of saying that we can do it, that we are somehow different or unique, and that we have our own way of doing things, it's going to be more and more important, even in terms of how Russia gets its ideas across. Right now, Russia is searching for a way of using its soft power to influence the world. It certainly has hard power, and we know that. Missiles would be just one very good example. But it hasn't yet come up with why, or let's say its values in the world. And that is a dilemma. The United States, this may be, I'll just give you 2 minutes on what's percolating in my mind, but the United States talks a lot about democracy in the world. The Russians, as one person told me when I was in Moscow a couple of weeks ago, believe that this is really kind of a rebranding, as one person in English told me, the world's biggest rebranding. They said, you used to promote capitalism, and now you promote democracy. And it was said with a very cynical expression that actually, some people there would argue, you don't really believe in democracy. What you're doing is you just want to influence the rest of the world for your whatever nefarious purpose, which might be business, increasing business, or access to raw materials, but you really don't believe it. And yet, I would argue that there is that trend in the United States to values, but Russia hasn't really defined what its values are, what it wants. And yet, if you get into some of the examples, the Boeing example, or some of the trade issues that you're talking about, trade and economics, those are things that Americans and Russians can find commonality on. Again, I go back to the experience that I had in the Far East, of people whom I immediately understood because they felt like people who just wanted to get things done, make money, improve their communities. And that it resonated very much with me as a person who comes from the United States. Unfortunately, working in the media, I'll tell you, this is a very difficult story to tell right now. It's extremely difficult because I don't think the image of Russia has been worse in recent memory. Right now, it's very bad. There is a tendency, I think, in the United States, among some politically, to simply push Russia to the wall, to punish it, to raise the issues, let's say, of human rights, which I believe in, but to the exclusion of anything else that's happening in the world, or I should say in Russia. And this is creating a very, very tense situation. I, as being kind of in the middle, find very few opportunities to tell balanced, positive stories, because there just isn't room in the daily press of events and news to talk about some of the more positive aspects. I do think that business is one of the best ways that you can tell that story, because it's something that Americans identify with. Jobs, people in other countries, working for the same objective. So I'm hoping that to kind of bring it back to the WTO, that if Russia really does move forward, and it is a process, and it will take a long time, but if Russia moves forward, becomes more integrated, provides opportunities for its own people and its own companies to institute reform, to compete, to have the preparation for people who are working in those industries, then there will be more commonality with other people, and especially with the United States. And it could bring the countries closer together in understanding. Right now, I am a little pessimistic in terms of that happening on a, let's say, a popular basis in the media. But I would hope that in the future, this can improve. I did talk, I'll bring you one more tidbit from talking to a very highly placed person on the American side in Moscow, politically and diplomatically, who was saying that before the election, and actually I should say before the elections, ours and theirs, there was hope that some of the rhetoric in Russia was just because you had to do it domestically, that the criticism of the United States, the vilification of the United States, was just kind of a temporary thing to win some votes and to strengthen the base, kind of the way it happens here in the United States. But there is concern among people on the American side that that's not going away, that some of these trends of criticism and comments about, let's say, anti-Americanism is continuing, when actually there was some assurance coming from the Russian side that it would be diminished after the election. That doesn't appear to be happening. That's worrisome. And I think by the same token, in the United States, as soon as Russia gets on its high horse and starts acting that way, Americans do too. And it's a bad combination. So again, that's my, I guess, reality check, but I'd be happy to answer some questions or discuss. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. Although one thing I can't help thinking is that in Russia, the press is pretty well controlled, whereas it definitely isn't here. So in terms of what the domestic audience in Russia is getting fed, that's kind of a little bit of a two-way.
That is true. But Laura, I just wanted to, on that point, a very interesting thing that I just heard recently this week, or last week, here in D.C. at a conference that included a young Russian who was from Siberia, in fact. He said that if you look at the demographics, TV, obviously, great penetration, and all of the adults in Russia watch it. However, among younger people, 20s and 30s, very few of them are watching it. They're all on the internet. It's a very different, and I think very interesting trend, that they are not paying a whole lot of attention to what the government is saying. They're on the internet, and there are no limits on what they can get from the internet. So we could have a shift, I think, in some of the influence of the government in not so long down the road in Russia.
Well, I want to open it up to questions, although one thing that perhaps Travis and Matt can also comment on is that there's been a very good exposition of how the economic relationship really, I like your term, that serves as ballast for the greater U.S.-Russia relationship, and your great example of Boeing, and something that came up less today, which is the diplomatic ties between our countries, and how that also sometimes can serve as ballast, even though that also doesn't always hit the front pages, the reasons that we value the relationship with Russia. But in terms of particularly of the U.S.-Russia relationship, the political relationship, and I think more importantly, the political tendencies in Russia today must impact the U.S.-Russia business relationship and the kinds of questions, particularly for the government, that we are going to choose to have with Russia. And I recognize that's not, for example, maybe your area of expertise, but we are a country of values, and we do choose the countries with whom we have relationships with. So I wonder if you want to comment a little on that.
Well, I'll venture out onto that hazardous terrain a little bit. Russia is first of all, it's a country where we have a lot of intersecting interests on a whole variety of planes, from the work we're doing with some support from them in Afghanistan, to working together with varying levels of convergence or divergence of opinion on how to deal with security issues involving third countries, whether it's North Korea or Libya or Syria. You can see a bit of a spectrum of different Russian responses and different stances in those issues. To the economic area, we have a tremendous range of interests. So we have to have a relationship with them. I didn't mention space cooperation. We are certainly not, going to be able to have a meeting of the minds with them on every issue on which we intersect. We do have a lot of diplomatic engagement going on day to day. To the extent that that diplomatic engagement goes on in public, that certainly has an impact on the business communities in both countries, in what they perceive as the signals from their respective governments. Is it okay to do business with Russia? Is it okay for us to tour the U.S. and go visit some of their facilities? And we've seen some impacts on adverse impacts even just recently. Of course, if you've been following Russia, you know that several of their parliamentarians have been caught up in a bit of a scandal because there are financial disclosures laws in Russia, which former President Medvedev promulgated, which most people regarded as a step in the right direction. But in practice, these requirements have been honored in the breach more so than in reality by a lot of people in Russia. And but the standard is there, and now it's come to light that quite a number of officials, both in the government and in the legislature, have not been complying, and this creates some points of vulnerability. And some of these guys have been actually put in situations where they felt compelled to resign. We've had some delegations of parliamentarians who were actually planning to come here and engage with people in our government, with people in our business community, and just because of doing a bit of a finger to the wind test of the politics over there, they've decided in some cases that maybe this isn't the best time for them to come to the United States, and that's that's a bit worrisome because there's a very concrete example of an uncertain, high-level political relationship having a chilling impact on things that people on both sides want to do together and have common interests in at a business level. As Jill indicated, I think Russia right now publicly has they have a very difficult time finding what's their what is going to be our attractive message? What kind of values are we going to articulate out there? The U.S. is, when we talk about human rights, that's a very compelling narrative there. But when you hear Russian leaders speak up in diplomatic situations, or when they're meeting with people from third countries, such as the recent meeting with the Chinese leadership, the compelling narrative that seems to come out of there is, the concept of non-interference. Basically giving countries space to mind their own internal affairs, as they say, the way they want. That's not such a compelling message. So that the diplomatic context publicly is challenging right now.
Good comments. Well, listen, I'll just comment by saying, certainly politics does matter, and it particularly matters if you are a company like Boeing, which is well recognized as an American company and Brandon Associated. So whether we like it or not, we are brought into that political relationship. The second piece of it is certainly just the magnitude of what we do is such that there's a lot of visibility related to some of the things we sell. And when you're doing a $10 billion aircraft sale, it starts to attract, presidents and prime ministers and secretaries of commerce and others literally at the signings of what you do. So inevitably, politics plays into the relationship of what we do at the highest level. It also plays it at a very mechanical level. We have, in some of the stuff that we do in the Design and Engineering Center, it is export controlled. So we need licenses for a lot of the technology that we work with the Russians. And so obviously, if you have challenges in the relationship, and we have security agencies in the United States starting to clamp down, that starts to limit some of the things that we can do. And so Boeing's position on this has really been, on the one hand, to really articulate the benefits of good relationships between these two countries. That clearly the U.S. side, that to the extent that we can support aircraft sales, it's a lot of U.S. jobs. It really helps the U.S. economy. And on the Russian side, the extent that you are part of that relationship, gaining from the supplier relationship, the design and engineering expertise, the jobs that come with that, that ensuring and supporting those commercial relationships are in both of your interests. And so toward that end, a lot of what we do is try to create that fact on the ground and to really make clear that we want both countries, both political leaders or political bodies, engage in a recognition that good political relationships can support good commercial relationships that have benefits for both sides. And some days we're more successful than others, but as a company, I think that can be the best role that we can play, is demonstrating that solid political relationships help support both sides, and creating challenges in that really is not in anyone's interest.
I'd like to open it up. Yes, question. Angela.
Thank you. Do I need a, thank you. Angela Sten from Georgetown University. Thank you for a very interesting panel. It's wonderful to have a former and a current student on the panel, too. I'll take full credit. The U.S.-Russian relationship is obviously a compartmented relationship. We've heard this. And some parts of it work well. Obviously, Boeing is a shining example of what does work well, and the economic relationship does. But politically, as we've heard from Jill, I mean, right now, the enemy image of the United States is a very important part of the domestic sort of debate in Russia. It's very much a domestic thing. So my question to you is, can you talk about instances where, an improved and a solid economic relationship can have a positive impact on the political relationship, not politics influencing economics, but do you think there is any spillover, or do you think that what we'll see in the future is you'll have, parts of this relationship, the economic segment, that work very well, but that really don't impact on the political relationship, and therefore, in the end, act as a constraint on growing the economic relationship too?
So I'll defer to Matt, who has, I think, a lot of experience on exactly this point. But I will say, just as being in that the policy world a little bit, to the extent that, and this is just a purely pragmatic political side of things, to the extent that you can create opportunities for both leaders to demonstrate to their people the values of the relationship on a commercial basis, you provide opportunities to progress the political relationship as well. In the business, we call them deliverables. And, for every major meeting between the two sides, there is a requirement, frankly, on both staff teams to find those deliverables where the leaders can sit down and demonstrate to their populaces that sitting together, working on the political relationship, has impacts back home. So Boeing, we're thrilled to be part of those deliverables when they come forward, and many other companies can get those deals done. And to the extent that on a very tactical level, that those deals help support positive political meetings, I think you can see some influence there. Now, that certainly it's not going to affect all political issues, and there's some that really are going to be dealt with on a political basis. But to the extent that the commercial relationship can continue to generate good news stories, I think it can really be an enabler to get through some of the other thorny political issues. Matt?
I won't say too much more on that, but I will say that there's I think maybe an impression of the Russian political leadership as very homogeneous, and it's true that there is a very fairly rigid hierarchy. Putin has devoted a lot of effort to constructing the the vertical vlasti, the vertical chain of command in Russia. But I mentioned this unfortunate instance of the parliamentarians canceling a visit, but at the same time, simultaneously, we have lots of very senior Russian officials who are continuing to engage with us, continuing to look for things that our companies and their companies can do together in the economic area. Next week, we'll have one of their deputy ministers of industry and trade who will be up in Detroit meeting with people in the motor vehicle industry, and an event that's being organized by the U.S.-Russia Business Council. We have a number of those visits that are occurring on an ongoing basis. These people are in position to report back to their higher-ups on the stakes that they do have in this growing trade and investment relationship, and so I think those are being factored in. What I don't know is how influential they are on any given issue at any given point in time.
Yeah, I mean, I would just follow up on my point there by even suggesting, too, if you think politics, so much of politics is about politicians answering questions to their constituents of why you're doing something, right? And if you think about it from the standpoint of political relationships, I mean, both sides have to convey to their peoples why a good, solid political relationship is beneficial. Maybe if it's not in your direct national interest to make a compromise, it's good for the overall political relationship, you need to be able to tell why. And to the extent that the commercial relationship can generate those answers and those examples of why it does matter that we're doing these things together, why it does matter that we're working on compromise, because we have beneficial outcomes for our economies, I think that's really how commercial relations can drive forward the broader relationship.
Can I just say one very quick thing, because I see the questions. If you take an average American consumer and they go to the store, they know about China, they probably know about Vietnam. I notice more clothes being made in like Sri Lanka, Turkey, et cetera. So that has an influence on me. It changes my opinion. In the case of China, usually it's pretty negative, but the kind of Walmart approach. Tell me the last product you saw made in Russia in the United States. Vodka, exactly. I once bought a sport jacket that was made in Russia, and I thought, made in Russia? What? So I think that most Americans don't know that Russia is involved in Boeing. And most Russians have, I should say most Americans have no idea that we have any type of trade relationship with Russia. All they think of is repression, nuclear weapons. I'm really, truly, maybe I'm exaggerating, but I don't think much. So that is one of the problems. It's never talked about, and in the media, there's not a big opening for a whole lot of stories on Russia, and the negative ones tend to fill that space.
Question over here? Yeah.
Andy Petchins, CSX. I have a comment and a question. The comment stems from Jill's last. First of all, thanks for all panels. Great presentations. Really enjoyed them. The last comment about wondering why Mr. Putin has and the Russian government has been on this anti-American propaganda campaign, and whether it's really actually useful for domestic politics. I've actually always been rather skeptical of that thesis, and thinking that I don't think really Mr. Putin needs this. I've thought this for years, but fortunately, there was some actual research done on this question by Ted Gerber, a colleague of a number of us who belong to this group, PONARS. It was founded 16 years ago as relatively young Russian and Eurasian experts. Steve and I were founding members. Now we're heavier and grayer and balder, but the thesis of Ted's.
I just want to thank Andy for including me in that.
For guys, that's an endearment, The deeper the insult, the more we like you. Okay, back to the point. The point of Ted Gerber's paper from the University of Wisconsin is based on survey research, is that it fairly conclusively demonstrated that there really isn't, the anti-American propaganda was not helping Putin in his presidential election. And my conclusion from that and other observations is, it's not a very happy conclusion, is that Mr. Putin says these things, and he leads his government to say these things, because he fundamentally believes them. And he doesn't care, really, about Russian domestic opinion in that regard. Now that's an assumption or hypothesis, but and it also, in my view, it's not from his KGB experience. It's not from his experience of being a Cold Warrior. I think it's basically comes from his experience in how he processed or what he learned, how he processed what he learned in his experience for the last 12 or 13 years dealing on a day-to-day basis with the United States. And that's his conclusion. We have a long argument about it, but I just, I'll leave it at that. The question probably goes more to Travis and Matt. A possible greenfield in U.S.-Russian commercial cooperation would be in the military-industrial complex. Now, obviously, in Boeing, you've been close to that, but you're working on the civilian side with the Russians, as far as I know. You know, this could possibly be an area that, to get to Angela's point, where economic cooperation could have some political effect. If you think about some of the constituencies in the Russian Federation that are most likely to view the United States negatively because of their interests, it would be that in the military-industrial complex. I think we underestimate, for example, how when NATO expanded back in the 1990s, and again, for part of the reasons the Russians were upset was they're losing markets. They're losing markets in East Central Europe. Now the Russians are talking about major military modernization, and I think in like most areas of high technology, obviously 30 years ago. The Russians, were right up there with world class, but their R&D base has eroded tremendously. I think they have to think realistically about finding niches in these global supply chains, including in the military-industrial complex. And I wonder to what extent you're kind of thinking about that in Boeing, and to what extent that's being thought about inside the U.S. government. Thanks.
Well, I'll speak briefly, and then maybe let Travis talk more about some of the practical aspects of it. Certainly, we have to pay attention to our national security interests. We have an export control process that the Commerce Department has a certain slice of administering, but we do that jointly with the State Department and Defense Department and other agencies that have interests and information to bring to bear to decisions on to what extent we can collaborate, to what extent we can share information, to what extent we can share technologies. I think there are people in our security policy hierarchies who do look at opportunities to collaborate with the Russians where we have mutual interests and no downsides. I think there's been some public attention given to for instance, efforts to purchase Russian equipment. I think Russian helicopters and such for countries in Central Asia, Afghanistan, and elsewhere, where there are some synergies with existing equipment. But at the same time, we and our companies, of course, they would love to be able to expand what they're doing. But at the same time, we have to be mindful of some of the implications of having our technology out there. Not so much that very many people expect that we're going to be, in conflict with Russia, because people on both sides recognize the drawbacks of that. But in terms of diversion of technologies to third countries, that is that's a very big question mark area. We don't know what we might encounter in places like Iran or North Korea or some of the other maybe non-state entities with which those countries might do business. And so we, there are imperatives to be very careful, and that's something that the mids here that are going to be out in the fleet and up in the air are going to have to wrestle with as they move up into the policy hierarchy as well.
No, I mean, great comments. Listen, I'd say there's two, it's an intriguing idea. I think there's two considerations. One is clearly U.S. government policy and export control, and certainly anything with a military application falls into that realm of ITAR controls that frankly just make doing business in that realm, in some cases, legally impossible. But that may change, and that there is export control reform going on, and so there could be some changes that open up some opportunities. But there's a second consideration, which is when you look at this sector, the desire of countries to have indigenous capability to create their military capabilities. That's a big one. And you look at the Russians, and I think that would be a tough one to get over. My personal view, you obviously know Russia very well, but I think that would be another consideration as to the extent that they would actually import capability from outside Russia in some of those key areas. That might be difficult. So that, those are two considerations, but certainly something to explore. I think, one kind of area that's kind of the nexus between commercial and military, which we have done a degree of cooperation and engagement, is space. And so we have actually a great history of space cooperation with Russia. And that's something that blends into a little bit of that civil military stuff. And we've been able to get over some of the obstacles with a lot of support from the U.S. government in that regard. So that could be actually a pathway to broader cooperation. It's interesting from the standpoint of just relationships, because a lot of this does come down to relationships. We actually have pretty solid relationships with some of the key figures in their military-industrial complex, given just the way they're structured. You look at VSMPO, is part of an organization called Russia Technologies, which, if it's still the case, is the umbrella organization that includes Rosaboronexport, which is their primary arms exporter. Exactly. So the people and the individuals and the relationships, they're there, and we have some of those. So I think there is a foundation to potentially more work, but obviously those other two considerations would need to be addressed.
Oh, you, I'm sorry, yeah. Oh, sorry, yeah.
Helen Teplitskaya, President of the American-Russian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Thank you so much for your fabulous presentations and very meaningful observations. I very much hope that the Wilson Center Cannon Institute and the Washington University will take all efforts it takes to actually promote what the speakers said via the social networks, the internet, to go beyond the net, the headlines, and to overcome the biases that really dominate the media. I'm not trying to idealize Russian politics, but I honestly believe that it's not really a two-way street, that things have been grossly taken out of proportion. And I thank Jill for picking on a very subtle and very vital, I would say, moment about don't explain. It is true. And I think a greatest part of the misconception evolves from Russia's inability, or I would rather say unwillingness to lobby. And as a result, some of the latest lobbying efforts, for example, by Mr. Browder, and I'm not going to start talking about the Magnitsky case because it will overturn the whole agenda of the conference, but the lack of balance and the misconceptions that result as a result of lobbying by one individual, which impacts the interests of the whole country. Just for your information, the trade balance that was mentioned by Matt, and compare it to China, 88 billion in 2012, and it's going to grow to over, I believe, 200 billion by 2015. Imagine how many jobs, great opportunities. It pains me, it drives me crazy when I think about the sequester of the budget. And the question to you, do you believe that different yardsticks are being used to measure human rights and other political issues when it comes, for example, to Russia and China? I will remind you, maybe some of you attended the luncheon with then Congressman Hillary Clinton when she was running. I asked her about this different length of the yardstick. And the answer was, I will not quote exact language, but the essence of it is that China is the US banker. So I would suggest that we look, beyond the current situation, be more strategic, and stop letting China, really grow to the extent where we will all dance to the Chinese tunes, nothing against China per se. But if it has to be fair, it has to be fair. So please answer if you believe that different yardsticks are being used to measure Russia and China. Thank you.
Unfortunately, I guess I have to answer that. It's a very big question. I would say, I'll take kind of a popular approach. I would say yes. I would tend to agree. I'm not saying that this is a policy that is spread by or promoted by the United States government or anyone else. I'm just talking about, in a practical sense, how it is interpreted. But China is so big that it can't be ignored. I mean, that is part of it. And they are, as Hillary Clinton did say, America's banker. So what are you going to do? But I do think that the most important thing if Russia really wants to get its message across, and I wonder whether it actually does sometimes want to get its message across, but if it does, it has to be much more balanced. I mean, it has to be that this is a country that if you are on the internet as a 20-year-old in Moscow, and you're on the internet if you're a 20-year-old in China, there are very different things that you can access. I mean, in Moscow, you basically can access anything. And I don't think a lot of Americans quite understand that. Whose fault is that we don't understand that Russia is a much more complex country and has a lot more positive things about it? I can't really begin. I could write a thesis on why that is the case. But it's kind of what I'm doing. But I do think that right now the news, as we call it, the news hole for Russia is very small. The news hole for China is very big. And so what gets into that, what is covered with Russia is the most burning issue of the day. And it doesn't leave a lot of space unless you're particularly interested in Russia. You can find anything. But on a regular basis, on regular networks, you're not going to get a whole lot of news on Russia, and it's going to be probably the most burning issue of the day, sometimes the most sensational issue of the day. I don't know what the answer is, quite honestly. I do feel that we're in a transition, though. I mean, I do think that we have to remember where Russia came from and that we're only, a couple of decades down the road. And I think we sometimes forget that.
Well, we're going to have to close this really interesting discussion because of time. I wanted to welcome all the U.S. Naval Academy young people here today and encourage you to participate because you are our leaders of today and tomorrow, and your voices count. So we're really glad that you're here. This has been a terrific panel. Thank you, Matt, Jill, and Travis for leading off this what should be a really interesting day. So thank you all very much.
Absolutely, absolutely.